For many fans, modern Formula One has permanently turned into a perfectly directed show where marketing often defeats the sport. Hybrid power units, strict emission limits, and endless radio chatter, where engineers with laptops track the car's every single movement. The pinnacle of motorsport has become a simulation where electronics outweigh the driver's own instincts, and safety levels allow them to walk away unharmed from the most horrifying crashes. But if we rewind the clock 40 years, we see a completely different Formula One, raw, brutal, and uncompromising. This was an era when a tiny 1.5-liter engine sat behind the driver, but with absolutely no eco-standards or smart assists. In qualifying sessions, engineers turned up the turbo boost to such extremes that these units produced a staggering 1,500 horsepower. No power steering, no traction control. Just a manual gearbox and a driver literally sitting on a barrel of exotic rocket fuel. This was the unrestricted turbo era, a time of the greatest engineering madness, when mechanics brewed fuel from explosives, and drivers felt visceral fear before every start, knowing the engine behind them could detonate at any second. An era that the Federation was ultimately forced to ban simply so the drivers could survive. I'm Ilya, and you're watching Shifted. This is where automotive culture is built on raw engineering and the real stories behind the metal. And today, we will dissect the most extreme period in Formula One history. We will see how the grid's most laughable car defeated the reliable naturally aspirated engines. We'll find out why BMW engineers hunted for old engine blocks in junkyards and left them out in the rain. And we will understand how insane speeds triggered not only the rise of brilliant drivers, but also the most vicious psychological war in the history of motorsport. The late 70s. Formula One was ruled by an era of stability bordering on a monopoly. Most teams on the grid used the exact same engine, the 3-liter, naturally aspirated Ford Cosworth DFV. It was a brilliant, reliable, and refined piece of engineering, producing around 500 horsepower. Formula One had turned into an aerodynamics and chassis competition because the power units were practically identical. British teams like Lotus, McLaren, and Williams felt incredibly comfortable in this paradigm. But deep within the FIA rulebook, one forgotten line had been gathering dust for years. The regulations allowed for 3-liter naturally aspirated engines, or engines with a displacement of just 1.5 liters, but equipped with forced induction. Historically, this rule was created for old mechanical superchargers back in the 1950s. It was assumed that a 1.5-liter engine could never compete with a massive 3-liter V8. No engineer even looked in that direction. No one, except the French manufacturer Renault. In 1977, at the British Grand Prix in Silverstone, Renault brought their new car to the track, the RS01. Instead of the familiar big V8, sitting behind the driver was a tiny 1.5-liter V6, but bolted to it was a Garrett turbocharger, forcing compressed air into the cylinders. The paddock's reaction was a mix of bewilderment and arrogance. British constructors openly laughed at the French design, and for good reason. The turbo worked inconsistently, the engine overheated, and the chassis itself was severely overweight. But the ultimate problem was reliability. Almost every race for Renault ended exactly the same way. A sudden loss of speed, a loud bang, and a thick cloud of white smoke pouring from under the rear wing. Because of its distinctive yellow livery and constantly boiling engines, the British press and rivals gave the car a derogatory nickname, the Yellow Teapot. In their debut season, the team failed to score a single point. Formula One's naturally aspirated elite kept celebrating victories, dismissing turbocharging as an expensive and pointless mistake. But the French engineers methodically continued their work. They solved the cooling issues, experimenting with boost pressures and exotic materials. The point of no return in motorsport history arrived on July 1, 1979, at the Dijon-Prenois circuit during the French Grand Prix. Renault driver Jean-Pierre Jabouille didn't just take pole position. In the race itself, his yellow car with its tiny turbo engine methodically dismantled every naturally aspirated rival, crossing the line over 14 seconds ahead of the nearest pursuer. The laughter in the British garages instantly died. The Yellow Teapot was no longer boiling on the sidelines. It had just handed their reliable technology a colossal deficit on the straights. Post-race analytics revealed the obvious. Thanks to the turbo, the 1.5-liter Renault engine generated a power output physically impossible for the standard 3-liter naturally aspirated Cosworth. And worse for the competition, this technology had a virtually limitless potential for development. The era of naturally aspirated stability died that very day. Rival team owners realized if they didn't bolt turbos to their cars in the near future, they would remain backmarkers forever. Thus, Formula One opened Pandora's box. The most massive and insane arms race in the history of motorsport had begun. Renault's success triggered an irreversible chain reaction. Gigantic manufacturer budgets began flooding into Formula One. Ferrari, Honda, Porsche, they all rushed to develop their own turbocharged engines, trying to outdo one another. But the most radical and insane approach was taken by the Bavarians at BMW. The brilliant engineer Paul Rosche was responsible for creating their engine. Instead of designing a state-of-the-art power plant from scratch, he made a decision that seems highly controversial today. As a foundation, he took the standard cast-iron M10 engine block from mass-produced BMW street cars, which had been in production since the early 60s. But Rosche wasn't interested in shiny new parts from the factory. He needed metal that had already passed the brutal test of time. BMW mechanics literally scoured junkyards, buying up old engine blocks from used cars with over 100,000 kilometers on the clock. Rosche's logic was flawless. Over years of operation, through thousands of heating and cooling cycles, the cast iron was relieved of its internal structural stress. If a block hadn't cracked after 100,000 kilometers on the street, it would withstand the boost pressures of Formula One. Then the real engineering alchemy began. The salvaged blocks were taken to the backyard of the BMW motorsport facility and left out in the open under the rain and snow for several months. Moreover, there is a famous legend, confirmed by those involved, that team mechanics regularly urinated on these blocks. It was believed that the urea further nitrided and hardened the metal. And it was exactly from this old street-used cast iron that the Bavarians created the most powerful engine in the history of motorsport, the BMW M12/13. In race trim, this 1.5-liter motor produced a perfectly acceptable 800 to 900 horsepower. But the real madness began on Saturday, during qualifying. Teams used what became known as grenade engines. These were specially assembled units designed to live for exactly 3 laps. An out lap, 1 flying lap to set a time, and an in lap. Before sending the car out, mechanics simply bolted the wastegate shut, allowing the turbo to force a colossal 5.5 bar of boost into the cylinders. For comparison, in modern street-legal sports cars, a turbo rarely blows more than 1 to 1.5 bar. When Paul Rosche was later asked what maximum power his engine produced in qualifying, he coolly replied, "We don't know for sure. Our dyno could only measure up to 1,280 horsepower, after which the needle just pinned against the limiter. It was probably around 1,400 or 1,500 horsepower. 1,500 horsepower. From an engine displacement smaller than a bottle of soda in a chassis that weighed less than 600 kilograms. After that single flying lap, the engine practically melted from the inside out. It was pulled from the car and thrown straight in the trash, replaced with a fresh one for the race, but it had already fulfilled its mission. This was an era where metal was deliberately pushed to the absolute edge of destruction. Yet, the only true restrictor for all this power was the fear of the driver himself. And what the drivers faced inside these machines demanded not just talent, but pure survival instinct. 1,500 horsepower is an impressive figure on paper, but in reality, it meant engineers had created engines that vastly outpaced the capabilities of the chassis, the aerodynamics, and most importantly, human reflexes. Today's Formula One drivers steer the car without ever taking their hands off the wheel. Yes, the electronics that would help brake or catch the car in a slide have long been banned, but modern hybrid systems deliver power as smoothly and linearly as possible. The semi-automatic gearbox shifts gears in milliseconds, and power steering relieves a colossal load from the arms. In the 80s, none of this existed. Drivers sat in cramped cockpits made of aluminum and early carbon fiber. Their legs were often positioned ahead of the front axle, right in the crash crumple zone. To shift gears, the driver had to take one hand off the heavy steering wheel at 300 kilometers per hour and wrestle with a stiff manual gearbox. But the driver's main enemy was the phenomenon that went down in history as turbo lag. The massive turbochargers of the time spooled up incredibly slowly. When the driver applied the throttle, the engine didn't react immediately. The delay could last 2, sometimes 3 endless seconds. Imagine the physics of this process. The driver brakes before the corner, scrubs off speed, and applies the throttle even before the car reaches the apex. 1 second, nothing happens. 2, the engine only begins to spool, and suddenly, at the trickiest point of the corner, with the steering lock applied, the turbo reaches peak boost. A shockwave of 1,000 horsepower instantly slams into the rear wheels. If the driver applied the throttle a fraction of a second too late, they lost precious time on corner exit. If a fraction too early, the car instantly snapped into an uncontrollable slide and flew into the barriers. Former Formula One driver Gerhard Berger recalled the qualifying sessions of those years with cold horror. You open the throttle at the start of the straight, and your head just snaps back from the impact. You forget how to breathe. The steering wheel violently tears from your hands, and all you try to do is keep this rocket between the white lines. You felt that the car wanted to kill you. Driving turned into predicting the future. Drivers had to feel the turbo timing on a purely instinctive level. This exact era birthed unique driving styles. For instance, a young Ayrton Senna, driving for Lotus, developed his famous throttle dance. Through the corners, he didn't keep it pinned constantly. Instead, he delivered a series of rapid, short stabs with his foot. This allowed him to maintain high turbo RPMs, preventing it from falling asleep, while simultaneously keeping the rear wheels from breaking traction. Alain Prost, Nelson Piquet, Nigel Mansell, these men didn't just drive cars. They balanced on the fine line between sheer genius and suicide every single time they left the pit lane. But the most terrifying moments happened on Saturday during qualifying. When mechanics cranked the turbo boost to the maximum 5.5 bar, the drivers knew the engine behind them was operating on the absolute limit and could detonate at any given second. British driver Derek Warwick later confessed that before starting a flying lap, he literally prayed that the glowing hot chunk of metal wouldn't explode right into his back while the car was flying at top speed. They felt a primal fear of their own machines, but they still pinned the throttle to the floor. As boost pressures increased, teams faced a new problem that couldn't be solved with metal alone. Standard racing fuel could no longer cope. Under 4 or 5 bar of pressure, the mixture detonated prematurely in the cylinders, literally tearing the engines apart from the inside. And so, Formula One engineers turned the paddock into a true laboratory of the dark arts. British, German, and Japanese teams started bringing in chemical corporations to create unique formulas. They started pouring mixtures into the tanks that had very little in common with conventional gasoline. The foundation of this cocktail was toluene, an aggressive chemical compound used during World War II in aviation fuel and explosives. For some teams, the proportion of toluene reached over 80%. This was literal rocket fuel. The mechanics responsible for it had to work in special protective aprons, thick gloves, and sometimes even gas masks. If a drop of this toxic mixture accidentally landed on the car's bodywork, it instantly ate through the paint right down to the carbon fiber. The exhaust gases from these engines physically burned the eyes and seared the airways of anyone standing in the pit lane. But the exotic power of this rocket fuel demanded exotic grip as well. Unleashing 1,500 horsepower onto the track on standard racing tires meant turning the car into an uncontrollable spinning top. So, tire companies like Goodyear and Michelin created another phenomenon of the 80s, qualifying rubber. These were tires brewed from a compound so soft that its consistency resembled chewing gum. Once up to temperature, qualifying rubber literally stuck to the tarmac, allowing drivers to take high-speed sweepers pulling G-forces previously considered impossible. There was just one catch. The lifespan of these tires was exactly 5 kilometers. They lasted for exactly one phenomenal flying lap. After that, the rubber simply delaminated and shredded to pieces. Realizing the situation was spiraling out of control, the FIA attempted to intervene. Officials began artificially restricting fuel tank capacity, first to 220 liters, then 195. They hoped this would force teams to turn down the turbo boost just to make it to the finish line. But the engineers responded with their own sheer genius. Since the rulebook limited the volume of the tank, not the mass of the fuel, teams started freezing their chemical mixture before the race. Barrels of toluene were packed in dry ice. Under extreme cooling, the liquid contracted, and mechanics managed to squeeze a few crucial extra liters into the mandated 195-liter tank. During the race, the fuel heated up and expanded. Engineers masterfully found loopholes in the rules, fooled the inspectors, and played with chemistry. But they couldn't fool the limits of the human body and the layouts of old circuits. Cornering speeds increased so drastically that Formula One pushed right up against the red line. Any driver error or mechanical failure at that speed now guaranteed a catastrophe. The turbo era was hurtling toward its bloody and inevitable climax. Formula One's evolution always walked hand in hand with danger, but in the mid-80s, that line was completely erased. Cars generated over 1,000 horsepower in race trim. Aerodynamics pinned them to the ground with such force that drivers could barely withstand the cornering G-forces, and old European circuits with their narrow runoff areas turned into corridors of death. And this death wasn't abstract. The point of no return was 1986 at the Paul Ricard circuit in France. During testing, Italian driver Elio De Angelis's overpowered Brabham turbo car suddenly lost downforce at massive speed due to a rear wing failure. The car lifted off the ground, vaulted the barrier, and burst into flames. But the worst part wasn't the impact itself. Elio survived it, suffering only a broken collarbone. The true horror was that he was trapped in the cockpit. Since it was merely a test session, there were almost no track marshals or firemen around. Other drivers, Alain Prost and Nigel Mansell, stopped their cars and desperately tried to pull De Angelis from the fire with their bare hands, but failed. The toxic smoke from the exotic fuel burned his lungs. He suffered irreversible brain damage even before the rescue helicopter, which took an eternity, finally landed on the track. This tragedy shocked the entire paddock. It was after De Angelis's death that the Federation's leadership realized a horrifying truth. The cars had started killing the best. FIA president decided enough was enough. The turbo era had to be stopped, but doing it instantly was impossible due to multi-million-dollar contracts with manufacturers. Therefore, the FIA chose a different path. They began to slowly suffocate their own creation. The officials' primary weapon became the pop-off valve, a mechanical pressure relief valve. In 1987, the Federation mandated that all teams install this device, which forcibly limited boost pressure to 4 bar. If the turbo tried to blow anymore, the valve simply popped open, whistling as it vented the air into the atmosphere. For the engineers, it was a painful blow, but the worst was yet to come for the drivers themselves. The fuel tanks had already been reduced to 195 liters, and now the boost was restricted too. Formula One abruptly changed its philosophy. Drivers, who just yesterday were taming absolute chaos and attacking every corner, now turned into strategists. Fuel consumption readouts appeared on the dashboards. Instead of pushing the throttle, drivers were forced to practice lift and coast, lifting off the pedal long before a corner and rolling on momentum to save a few drops of fuel. Those who ignored the math simply rolled to a halt a kilometer before the finish line with bone-dry tanks. But the final nail in the coffin of the turbo era was the 1988 season. The Federation tightened the belt to the absolute maximum. Turbo boost was choked down to a miserable 2.5 bar, and fuel capacity was slashed to 150 liters. Everyone knew it was the end. From the following year, 1989, turbos were completely and unconditionally banned. Yet it was in this final year of agony that the world witnessed the most perfected machine in motorsport history. McLaren, partnering with the brilliant engine builders at Honda, created the MP4/4. While rivals tried to adapt old cars to the new rules, engineers Gordon Murray and Steve Nichols built an uncompromisingly low, aggressive, and perfectly balanced chassis. The car proved so flawless that the rest of the grid simply ceased to exist as a threat. Behind the wheel sat Ayrton Senna and Alain Prost, and very quickly they realized the only rival for a McLaren driver was now the other McLaren driver. The lack of external competition turned the team into a closed-door boxing ring. Armed with identical machinery, Senna and Prost stopped sharing telemetry, spied on the mechanics' setups, and ruthlessly squeezed each other off the tarmac at ultra-high speeds. But the paradox of this rivalry was that it became the catalyst for their speed. Trying to psychologically break one another, they wrung the absolute maximum out of the MP4/4 on every lap of every race. While other teams fought the fuel limits, the two McLaren drivers fought strictly against each other for every millimeter of the track. The result of this internal warfare turned into a statistical anomaly. Despite the reduced boost and a strict 150-liter fuel limit, McLaren won 15 out of the 16 championship rounds. When the checkered flag dropped for the final time at the 1988 Australian Grand Prix, it marked more than just the end of the season. It closed the most extreme, insane, and romantic chapter in the history of Formula One. The turbos fell silent, the cars became naturally aspirated once again, and motorsport forever lost that primal wildness that made it so great. The 80s turbo era proved one thing: absolute engineering freedom always walks hand in hand with pure madness. Yes, these machines were dangerous, but they gave us the rawest emotions and the most incredible drivers. What do you think? Should modern Formula One become more brutal and strip away the electronic assists? Or is today's level of technology the only logical path forward? Drop your thoughts in the comments. As always, I'm Ilya. I'll see you in the next episode of Shifted.